Tonight we're going to begin by what Kate has described as arias, followed by recitative. We're going to begin by each of the four members of the panel talking about their dealings with history and to read a little from their work. Then we're going to have a conversation amongst ourselves, and then towards the end there'll be some minutes for questions if the audience, members of the audience would like to ask some questions. Let me introduce the panel tonight. Javier Cercas, sitting to my right here. Born in Franco's Spain, he writes both fact and fiction about the dark recent past of his country. And he also writes for one of the great newspapers of the world, El País, from time to time. His most recent works are The Soleus of Salamis and The Anatomy of a Moment. Sitting immediately to my right here is Jenny Erpenpeck, who is an Aussie. Erpenpeck, I'm sorry, she's an Aussie. She was born in East Berlin, and her first calling was as an opera director. And then she began to write. I think it's the most fantastic dual career.
Never invited to Adelaide as an opera director, so I had to start writing.
You were too busy in Berlin and Graz and little places like that to get to Adelaide, I'm sure. But we won't go into the unhappy failure of Adelaide to get you here years ago as an opera director. She has been writing now for 20, 30 years? No, 20 years. 20 years. And
no. 12.
I invited the members of the panel to correct me severely if I made any mistakes. I didn't expect they'd take me literally. Jenny's most recent books are published in English as Visitation and Things That Happen. To my left, Kate Grenville, born Australia. She too has been writing about the recent past of this country, but the far past of white settlement in this country. And her three most recent novels dealing with the past as fiction are The Secret River, The Lieutenant, and most recently, Sarah Thornhill. And to my far left, Ron Rash, born South Carolina, writes about South Carolina. Poet, short story writer, novelist, indeed has a collection of poems which has tonight's title, Raising the Dead. And his most recent novels are Serena and The Cove. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the panel. I've asked all four members of the panel to think about why indeed it is they, as writers, raise the dead. And we're going to begin with each of them talking a little about their work and reading a little about their work. And we're going to be starting with Javier. Javier.
Thank you. I think I must, before tell the story, I must tell one story, little story. The first time Roman Jakobson, the great Russian linguistics, went to Harvard, he was welcomed by the president of the university, who told him, "Oh, Mr. Jakobson, somebody told me that you speak 14 languages." And he said, "Yes, it's true, but I speak all of them in Russian." So I speak English, as you see, but I speak it in Spanish. Oh, sorry. When I read it, it's worse, but anyway. I'm going to read not from my last book, which is The Anatomy of a Moment, but from a previous book called Soleus of Salamis. And that's why the title of this event is in fact one of the main, Raising the Dead is one of the main subjects of the book. The book revolves around tiny little obscure episode at the end of the Spanish Civil War, 1939, when this man called Rafael Sánchez Mazas, who was a fascist poet, fascist ideologue, after the war he was minister in Franco's government, he faced a firing squad. He miraculously escaped, and after that he was saved also miraculously by an enemy, by a Republican soldier. So all the book revolves around this tiny, obscure episode, as I said. But in the end, the main subject of the book is the idea of raising the dead. I mean, the fact that, to put it that way, memory is the heaven of people like me who don't believe in heaven. There's this poem by, this is an old subject in literature, you know, but there is this poem by Thomas Hardy, whose the title is The Second Death. He says that there is, when we die, we're not still dead. This is the first death. And we're not still dead because there's people who remember us. So I die tomorrow in the plane going back to Barcelona, and maybe you remember me because, oh, this guy was there with me. So I'm not still dead. But then there's a moment when nobody remembers me, and then I'm really dead. That's the second death, and that's the real death. So, well, that's the subject of the book, and that's why. I mean, the idea, the image of the book is, you know, dead people asking us, remember me, because as far as you remember me, I'm still, in a sense, alive. Well, that's why I'm going to read the first pages of the book. Maybe I should say that Falange is the fascist party, it was the fascist party in Spain. That also I should say that José Antonio Primo de Rivera was our Mussolini, something like that, the fascist leader of the fascist Spanish party, and also that Rafael Sánchez Ferlosio is the son of this Rafael Sánchez Mazas, who is, in a sense, one of the main characters of the book. And what else should I say before reading? Oh yeah, maybe that 18th July 1936 was the beginning of the war, the uprising of the militaries of Franco, and then the beginning of the war. So the beginning of the book goes like this. It was the summer of 1994, more than 6 years ago now, when I first heard about Rafael Sánchez Mazas facing the firing squad. Three things had just happened. First, my father had died. Then, my wife had left me. Finally, I'd given up my literary career. I'm lying. The truth is, of those three things, the first two are factual, even exact, but not the third. In reality, my career as a writer had never actually got started, so it would have been difficult to give it up. It'd be more accurate to say I gave it up having barely begun. I published my first novel in 1989. Like the collections of stories that appeared 2 years earlier, the book was received with glaring indifference. But a combination of vanity and an enthusiastic review written by a friend from those days contrived to convince me I could one day become a novelist, and to do so should quit my job as a journalist and devote myself entirely to writing. The results of this change in lifestyle were 5 years of economic, physical and metaphysical anguish, 3 unfinished novels, and a dreadful depression that knocked me back into an armchair in front of the television for 2 whole months. Fed up with paying the bills, including the one for my father's funeral, and watching me stare at the blank television screen and weep, my wife moved out as soon as I started to recover, and I was left with no choice but to forget my literary ambitions and ask for my old job back at the newspaper. I just turned 40, but luckily, or because I'm not a good writer, but nor am I a bad journalist, or more likely, because there was no one at the paper willing to do my job for a salary as meager as mine, they agreed. They assigned me to the culture section, which is where they put people they don't know what to do with. At first, with the undeclared aim of punishing my disloyalty, given that for some journalists, a colleague who leaves journalism to write a novel is nothing less than a traitor, they made me do everything but get the boss's coffee from the bar on the corner. And very few colleagues refrained from indulging in sarcasm and irony at my expense. Time must have blunted the memory of my infidelity. Soon I was editing the odd piece, writing articles, doing interviews. That was how, in July 1994, I ended up interviewing Rafael Sánchez Ferlosio, who was giving a series of lectures at the university at the time. I knew Ferlosio was extremely reluctant to speak to journalists, but thanks to a friend, or rather a friend of that friend who'd organized Ferlosio's stay in the city, I managed to get him to agree to talk to me for a while. Calling that an interview would be going a bit far. If it was an interview, it was the weirdest one I've ever done. To begin with, Ferlosio showed up on the terrace of the bistro surrounded by a swarm of friends, disciples, admirers, and hangers-on. This, added to an obvious lack of attention to his clothes and a physical appearance that inextricably blended the manner of a Castilian aristocrat ashamed of being one with that of an old Mongol warrior, massive head, unruly hair streaked with grey, hard, emaciated, difficult face, large nose and cheeks shadowed with an incipient beard, might have suggested to an informed observer a religious guru surrounded by acolytes. Moreover, Ferlosio roundly refused to answer a single one of the questions I put to him, claiming that he'd given the best answers he was capable of in his books. This doesn't mean he didn't want to talk to me. Quite the contrary. As if seeking to refute his reputation for unsociability, or perhaps it's just an unfounded, he was extremely cordial, and the afternoon flew by as we chatted. The problem was that if I asked him, say, about his division of literary personae into those of fate and those of character, he would contrive to answer me with a discourse on, say, the causes of the rout of the Persian fleet in the Battle of Salamis. Whereas when I tried to extract his opinion on, say, the pomp and ceremony of the celebration of the 500th anniversary of the conquest of Americas, he would answer me by describing, with a wealth of gesticulation and detail, say, the correct use of a jackplane. It was an exhausting tug of war, and it wasn't until the last beer of the evening that Ferlosio told the story of his father facing the firing squad, the story that's kept me in suspense for the last 2 years. I don't remember who mentioned the name Rafael Sánchez Mazas, or how it came up. Maybe it was one of Ferlosio's friends, maybe Ferlosio himself. But I do remember Ferlosio telling us, "They shot him not far from here, at the Cullell Sanctuary." He looked at me. "Have you ever been there?" "Me neither, but I know it's near Banyolas." It was at the end of the war. The 18th July had caught him in Madrid, and he had to seek refuge in the Chilean embassy, where he spent more than a year. Towards the end of 1937, he escaped from the embassy and left Madrid hidden in a truck, perhaps with the aim of getting to France. However, they arrested him in Barcelona, and when Franco's troops were about to reach the city, took him to Cullell, up near the border. That's where they shot him. It was an execution by firing squad en masse, probably chaotic, because the war was already lost and the Republicans were rushing helter-skelter for the Pyrenees, so I don't think they knew they were executing one of the founders of the Falange and a personal friend of José Antonio Primo de Rivera at that. My father always kept the trousers and sheepskin jacket he was wearing when they shot him. He showed them to me many times. They're probably still around. The trousers had holes in them because the bullets only grazed him, and he took advantage of the confusion of the moment to run and hide in the woods. From there, sheltering in a ditch, he heard the dogs barking and the shots and the soldiers' voices as they searched for him, knowing they couldn't waste much time searching because Franco's troops were on the hills. At some point, my father heard branches moving behind him. He turned and saw a militiaman looking at him. Then he heard a shout. "Is he there?" My father told how the soldier stared at him for a few seconds and then, without taking his eyes off him, shouted, "There's nobody over here." Turned and walked away. That's it. Thank you.
Jenny, why do we raise people from the dead? Speak and read.
I try again. Okay. I'm going to read a part of one of the 12 chapters of my book, Visitation. It's about a house situated at a lake close to Berlin, and every of the 12 chapters is told about one of the persons I considered important for the history of the house in the last 100 years, between more or less 1900 to 2000. And for me it was very interesting. I did a lot of research, but it's fiction anyway. And for me it was very interesting. I know the house, and I'm one of the chapters as well. And while writing the book, it became more and more important that to know all the stories that happened there or could have happened there. And I got the feeling that they are connected to the place still until now, and even if the people are gone under different circumstances, some of them were killed, some of them just had to flee, some of them just went away. And when I finished the book, all of them were in the book, and in a way they were in the house again. So this is the connection to the dead. I start reading now. It's the chapter about the architect who built the house in the beginning 30s, so about 1934. And the story starts with a moment when he has to leave the house in 51, sorry. He walks once more up the stairs, which creak at the second, seventh, and second to last step, passing his wife's room, from which emanates, as always, the smell of peppermint and camphor. The way to his studio leads him through the crepuscular room lined with cabinets. He'd built a small window there, semicircular, shaded like an eye by the straw roof. It wasn't long ago that a marten appeared to him at this window. The marten looked through the eye into the house just as he himself was looking out through the eye. Animal and man, both frozen there for a moment, and then the creature flitted away. The panes of frosted glass he had mounted in a frame of 2 times 3 panels in the door to his studio clink softly one last time as he approaches. He opens the door and enters, stands for a moment behind his drawing table and gazes down at the lake. The table is still covered with drawings for his first building in the Berlin city center, the most important commission in his life as an architect, the commission that has now caused his downfall. In the beams he hears the martins scrabbling. The martins are staying here. He walks back down the stairs. On the way down, they creak at the 2nd, 15th, and second to last step. He himself whittled grape leaves and clusters of their fruit on the finial at the bottom of the banister. Lock the door. In his trouser pocket, the key is jingling that can open and close all the doors of the house, including the apiary. That's right. It's not so easy. And the apiary and woodshed. Zeiss Econ, a key meeting the highest safety standards, quality German workmanship. Lock the door. And then crossing the living room, the light-colored slabs of sandstone beneath his footsteps in the entryway, 50 by 50 centimeters. The handle of the door to the vestibule made of brass, flat on top to sit well in the palm, edges grooved to offer traction to the thumb. When he depresses this handle, it emits, as always, a faint metallic sigh. The slabs of sandstone beneath his footsteps in the entryway, 30 by 30 centimeters. The birds on the door of the broom closet are flying. They've been flying there for a century. The flowers have been blossoming for a century. More grapes are hanging down. The Garden of Eden in 12 square chapters. He'd salvaged the door from an old farmhouse. Its beauty makes you forget entirely about the scrub brush, broom, bucket, dustpan and brush it conceals. Frame the view. That's what he has always thought. Lead the eye. In the kitchen, a faucet is dripping. Shut it off. Look out through the bull's eye panes at the sandy road and trees. The colored glass turns even the bare trees green. Frame the view. It's the first day of the new year. The gardener is still asleep. No one is out for a walk. Happy New Year. In 2 hours he'll be sitting in the S-Bahn to West Berlin. Lock the door. Lock the door and leave the key in the lock. He doesn't want them to break any of his bones. Doesn't want them to break down the door, twist off or saw apart the ironwork protecting the glass of the front door. This ironwork is painted red and black, just like the ironwork of the National Glider School that he'd worked on before the war, which was blown up just after the war ended. No one knew why. Lock the door. His profession used to encompass 3 dimensions: height, width, and depth. It was always his business to build things high, wide, and deep. But now the 4th dimension has caught up with him, time, which is now expelling him from house and home. We won't be doing any arresting over the weekend, the official said, and let him go, meaning that he wasn't going to be killed. He was just supposed to leave, get out, scram, make himself scarce, go to the devil. In 2 hours he'll be sitting in the S-Bahn that will bring him to West Berlin. 5 years at least, the official said, for the ton of screws he bought with his own money in the West to be used in the East. A ton of brass screws for the most important building of his life on Friedrichstraße in Berlin Mitte. A building for the state that is now driving him out. He knows much less than he used to. That's his profession, planning homes, planning a homeland. 4 walls around a block of air, wresting a block of air from amid all that burgeoning, billowing matter with claws of stone, pinning it down. Home. A house is your 3rd skin, after the skin made of flesh and clothing. Homestead. A house made to measure according to the needs of its master. eating, cooking, sleeping, bathing, defecating, children, guests, car, garden. Calculating all these weathers, all these thises and thats, in wood, stone, glass, straw and iron, setting out courses for lives, flooring beneath feet for corridors, vistas for eyes, doors for silence. And this here was his house. For the sitting to be done by his wife and himself, he designed the 2 chairs with leather cushions. For observing the sunset, he made the terrace with its view of the lake, and their shared pleasure at receiving guests had taken shape as a long table in the main room. The chill he and she felt in winter would be combated by the tiled heating stove from Holland, his and her weariness after ice skating by the bench beside the stove, and finally his drawing at the drafting table was provided for, as it were, by the studio. And now he had to consider himself lucky he was escaping with his life, suffering his third skin to be stripped from him and fleeing, insides glisteningly exposed to the safety of the West. Thank you.
Now, Kate, speak, read.
Oh, right. Too many bits of paper here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting tonight, the Kaurna people, and to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. 6 years ago or so, I wrote a book about my convict ancestor, who was a man with the rather splendid name of Solomon Wiseman. He was a boatman on the Thames in cold old London and a failed thief. On one dark night in 1804, he was caught trying to pinch a load of timber and was transported to Australia. As his great-great-great-granddaughter, all I can say is, thank God for that. Like most of the felons, he was soon freed, and then, as the family story has it, he took up land, that's in inverted commas, on the Hawkesbury River outside of Sydney, and proceeded to do well. Now, take up land, of course, is a euphemism, as I came to discover, for took land from its long-time owners, the Darug Aboriginal people. When I started researching the story of Solomon Wiseman, I discovered 2 things, which are really what got me writing this book. One, that I had no idea, as I was growing up, of the realities of Australian history. We learned about explorers, you probably did too, inland sea, all that stuff. Nothing about the actual details of what taking up land meant, which we're now knowing, thanks to historians like Henry Reynolds. The details of that taking up land were not pretty. The second thing that I discovered about my ancestor was a deafening silence about just how he had taken up his particular 100 acres. So for that reason, I wrote a novel rather than a biography, which is what I had set out to write. And I turned Solomon Wiseman, the real person, into the fictional character of William Thornhill so that I could explore the silence in my own family's history. The book is basically about how a kind of ordinary man, run-of-the-mill man, might be drawn into a barbaric act, those ones that obviously happened a lot on the frontier. And it's also about how that act might then be hidden, how it might become invisible. Wallpapered over, in fact, so that, 5 generations later, I could grow up knowing absolutely nothing about what had actually gone on the frontier. Now, it's asking for trouble to write a sequel to a book, so naturally that's what I did. Sarah Thornhill is obviously William Thornhill's daughter, and she grows up enjoying the benefits of what her father had taken, but never asking how her nice life was arrived at. So in many ways, Sarah Thornhill is about what happens when you wallpaper over the past, when you thoroughly bury the dead. Sarah Thornhill is based on my great-great-grandmother, and she was illiterate in the eyes of the gentry. She as I would have too, had the convict taint. The thing about these women is that they have vanished from history. These working class, illiterate women, by definition, have vanished from history. What we have as the stereotypes of 19th century women are the gentry, because they're the ones who could read and write, the power of the written word. So Sarah Thornhill is no helpless 19th century lady sitting around, getting the vapours because her hair's messy. Sarah Thornhill is smart and she's uppity. She decides, for example, to ride astride, not side saddle, which seems to me profoundly sensible, wears her brother's old pants in order to do this. This is not what we read about in Jane Austen, but it happened. She knows what she wants and she goes for it. She's sexy, energetic, unafraid of life. In many ways, she is her author's kind of wish fulfillment. I'd love to be a woman like Sarah Thornhill. Now, Sarah Thornhill only has eyes for big, handsome Jack Langland, who's the boy more or less next door, a few bends up the Hawkesbury River. His father was a convict too, but his mother was an Aboriginal woman. And that fact about Jack is what makes the wallpaper start peeling off around the Thornhill family. Secret River was about the making of a secret. This new book, Sarah Thornhill, is about what happens when the shit hits the fan about the secret. In these hallowed halls, I probably shouldn't have used that phrase, should I?
No, it's a technical term.
Thank you. Thank you, David. There's a kind of, there is a kind of rather hushed atmosphere here. It's these, it's this gothic stuff happening. Anyway, writing the book. I actually had a great time writing this book. To write about a woman like this in her voice was a wonderful opportunity. And she pretty much shoved me aside, actually, to write this book. I take credit for writing it, but actually on the cover it should say Sarah Thornhill, written by Sarah Thornhill, because she obviously didn't trust me to get her story right, so she almost literally gave me instructions. I was in New Zealand, walking up a volcano, as one does in New Zealand, going for a hike, basically, minding my own business, not thinking about the book that I was, very vaguely kind of back burner kind of stuff. And suddenly, halfway up the volcano, I can only say, and this sounds really oogie-boogie, not me at all, I was spoken to. A voice spoke to me and began to dictate this book. First of all, and it was Sarah Thornhill's voice, first of all she gave me a synopsis of the plot, very thoughtfully. And then, as if that mightn't be enough, she really didn't trust me. She then gave me a couple of sentences, which for a very long time were the first couple of sentences in the book. And I, of course, had gone hiking that day, not writing, so I had nothing to write on except the brown paper bag that my lunch had come on. And here it is, with the synopsis on one side. See, the grease spots are still there. And the first couple of sentences here on the other side. Thank you, Sarah Thornhill. So, I have to thank her for that. And in fact, I can feel her nudging me right now, saying, come on, get off, you've had enough, it's my go now. So I'll just quickly read a little bit of the book that she more or less dictated to me. This little section is at a point where she's just coming into puberty, just discovering, the joys of everything that happens at puberty. Her brother is called Will, and Jack, of course, is the person she's in love with. And Will and Jack are sealers, so they travel off to New Zealand for long periods of most years. Those years split up into the times that my brother Will and Jack was away and the times they was back. I turned 12 and Jack gave me 12 shells in a box, the whole thing small enough to fit in my palm. Every time they came back, there was the same private joke from Jack from our childhood. Still want to marry me, Sarah Thornhill? I turned 13 while they was away again, and I started to get a womanly shape, and my monthlies come. Marr was too genteel to talk about anything that went on in your insides, but my sister Mary was 15 going on 16. She'd had her monthlies for a few years. You can have babies now, Dolly, she said. That's what it means. I must have looked blank. "With a man, you know," she said. "You seen how the horses let down that tube thing they've got? Get up on the mare if you let them, put it inside. Same with people, only a bit nicer about it." So my body was becoming someone else's, and myself was too, but body and self neither settled yet into their shapes. I was restless, out of sorts, waiting to catch up with myself. "Have you got worms, Dolly?" Marr said. "You're restless as a cat." She came at me with the opening medicine, and I made myself sit still after that. Yes, I think you do know what opening medicine meant. I was sitting on the front steps one afternoon, staring out at nothing, wishing, but not knowing what I was wishing, when I heard the bench fall over. Pa jumping up so quick, he'd seen something down on the river, a boat. When I got to the jetty, the boat was still way off down the end of the reach, the sail hanging slack from the yard, the people on board no bigger than ants. One of them must be my brother Will, and one of the others would be Jack. That thought, Jack, brought something into my throat, as if I'd run too hard. I knew then what I hadn't known all those months of mooning about. It was Jack I was waiting for. When the boat got up to us at last, Jack jumped across the last yard of water, didn't wait for them to tie the boat up. So light on his feet for such a big man. Landed next to me, neat as a cat. "Well," he said, "it's Sarah Thornhill, I do believe." Same as I'd remembered, his eyes crinkled up with smiling. I saw the thought on his face. "Still want to marry me, Sarah Thornhill?" The humour of it was on his face. He took a breath. His mouth even started the words. But then he saw the new shape of me, changed his mind. The words hung between us. It was nothing, a silence the length of a heartbeat, and Jack's eyes looking into mine. But it said, "Everything is different now." When the others walked up to the house, the two of us hung back. Jack and I had walked up that track together 100 times, but I'd never had to think before how you walked beside someone. How much space did you leave between you? Did you touch them as you walked? Did your hand brush against theirs as it swung backwards and forwards? And exactly how did you breathe? Up in the house, I made sure I ended up next to Jack on the sofa. When an ember flew out from the grate, I put out my foot to snuff it. New boots from Abercrombie's, buttons up the side, made my feet look very small. I took my time with the ember. And when I sat back, I saw that Jack was smiling to himself. They'd had a dangerous time of it in New Zealand, not enough seals, so they had to go way down south, some little island in the middle of the ocean. "Hard to find as a damn flea," Will said. "Wasn't it, Jack?" But Jack was smiling at the fire, and I was the only one who knew why he wasn't listening, because my hip was jammed up tight against his, and where we touched, something was running from his body into mine, and from mine into his. I can only hope that all of you in this room have had that experience.
Kate, I've always wanted to ask, when the voice came on the mountain, did you stop walking?
Oh, yes.
You stopped walking.
And the thing about this volcano is it's made of really sharp lava. I don't know if any of you know this volcano in the middle of Auckland Harbour. Every couple of 100 yards, the voice made me keep sitting down on these unbelievably sharp rocks. By the end of the day, the bum of my jeans was in tatters.
So you knew from the start that she's going to make you pay.
That's right, yes. This was a woman who, pulled on her brother's old pants. She had no qualms about making me sort of sidle back to Auckland, keeping my front to everybody.
Ron, as it happens, makes his women ride astride as well. Ron, speak and read.
Okay. Well, I would first say that I defer to my fellow Southerner, William Faulkner, who says the past is not dead, it's not even past. So that's the premise, I think, of probably all my work, is that the past continues to resonate, and which I do believe. But I wanted to, it's interesting that Kate would bring that up, that point about hearing that voice, because I'm always leery about telling people these things because we sound insane. But it happens like that. It does come like that. And a few years ago, I received a phone call. I just published a novel where a number of the scenes were set during the Civil War. And a woman called me up. I don't think she even gave me her name, but she talked to me a little bit about the book, and then she said, "Do you know where your stories come from?" And I said no, because I don't think any of us, in some ways, don't. I mean, why does a character come to us in a certain time and place? And she said, "They're the stories the dead want told." And that's W-A-N-T. As a Southerner, I can't differentiate between want and want. But that always struck me, and it has haunted me, her saying that. Tonight, the book I'm going to read from is my first novel, One Foot in Eden. It's a book set in the Appalachian Mountains, actually in the South Carolina mountains. It's set in about 1952, most of it. And ultimately, it's a book about the destruction and the attempt to almost make into oblivion a community in 1972. And this is factual. Jocassee Valley, which many people considered the most beautiful valley in western North Carolina, was flooded for a hydroelectric dam. And I've always been haunted by man-made lakes. There's just something frightening about those, in the sense that even when cultures disappear, at least place names very often will remain. But when a lake covers up a place, and I was always haunted by that, and going to that lake, and it was always to me a haunted place. So part of what I wanted to do in One Foot in Eden was to, as you were saying earlier, not let it be forgotten, to bring back memory, and memory not just maybe of the people, but also of the whole culture, which was disappearing, and that including the folkways, the speech, and the mannerisms. And so I began a novel about a man named Billy Holcomb, who's in his very early 20s, and he's got a young wife, Amy, who is about 16 or 17, 16 when the book begins. And they've been trying to have a child, and they've been unsuccessful. And unfortunately, they finally go to a doctor in the nearest town and find out that Billy's infertile. And this causes a great deal of tension for both of them, because this is a very traditional community. It's early 1950s, and a woman's very often defined by having children. Amy actually comes from a very large family. So what happens is, in her desperation, and believing that it's the only way to save the marriage, she has an affair with a neighbor, a man named Holland Winchester, and actually ends up pregnant by him. When deep summer comes and the dog star rises with the morning sun, the land can scab up, and a man watches spring crop wrinkle brown like something on fire. As the seasoned snakes go blind, their eyeballs coat over like pearls, and they get mean. A rattlesnake allows no warning, and a milk snake that would have cut the dust to the tall grass in June quills up and strikes at anything that steps its way. It's a time when foxes and dogs go mad. They'll come shackling toward you, their lips snarly and chins white with slobber. You'll raise your gun and they'll come on like they just want to get it done with. Sometimes that time of year a man will act no different. A man who any another time would step around trouble. A man who, if his truth be known, might be a bit of a coward, will of a sudden turn mean and crazy. He'll do something nobody, even himself, would reckon likely. He'll even kill a man. You couldn't give me a child. I had to be with one that could, Amy said the first week of August, when her stomach swelled like a muskmelon, and neither of us could counterfeit any longer not to know. By then, that baby was about the only thing growing. Corn stalks stood dead in the fields, the beans half buried in gray dust. The only crop it looked to make it was tobacco I'd planted beside the river. That and some cabbage, if the groundhogs didn't get it. Whose child is it? I asked. Like when I'd been down by the river that spring plowing, I hadn't looked up. The Holland Winchester saw her past the big white oak that marked the property line between his family's land and mine. And like when I came back to eat my noon dinner that day, my beans and bread wasn't ready, and Holland had left his mark on Amy, a spot on her neck purpled like a fox grape. I waited for Amy to answer my question, my mind taking me back a month to the July afternoon I first suspicioned her being with child. The weather had turned summer by then, so the wash tub was out back near the well. After supper, Amy got her towel and such and went to bathe while I took my whetstone out and sharpened my scythe. She drawed the water early afternoon so it'd be sunny warm come evening. All she needed was to take off her clothes and get in. When I got my scythe sharpened, I tarried by the window and watched Amy bathe, because that was a sight so pretty as to make my heart ache. Not so much in a lusting way, but something somehow above that. A woman is never more pretty than when she's bathing, or so it was when I looked at Amy. A man bathes just to get dirt off him, but it seems more to a woman than that. Amy bathed in a slow, easeful way, like the soap and water washed away every care the day had laid on her. Then she took the tin and sloshed water over her head, and her yellow hair darkened to the color of honey. The sun had been slotchways over Sassafras Mountain, so when Amy raised from the wash tub, the water streamed off her like melting gold. There's no angel in heaven more lovely than this, I told myself. Then Amy turned as she stepped from the tub. I saw the curve in her belly, a curve no more than the scythe blade I held in my hand, but enough to wonder me about her and Holland Winchester. I raised my finger to the blade and ran it across the edge. I felt the steel cut right through. Drops of blood, bright like holly berries, spotted the floor. I hadn't wanted to follow that trail where Amy's ripening belly led. I tried for a month to keep what I suspicioned about Amy and Holland clear in my mind, but it came creeping back when my thoughts got idle. What really set the fear in me wasn't so much Amy carrying another man's baby, but losing her to that other man. Because in the years we'd been married, she became a part of me, ever sustaining as my legs. Even when I was in the fields and her up at the house, my thoughts was often upon her. I'd think of her in the house, cooking or canning, knowing that though we were working apart, we were still working for each other. So all that July, I hadn't offered a word to Amy about her belly. I'd known once it was words, something would come of those words. If that something was losing Amy, I'd be in a fix I couldn't see my way out of. I'd been like a man in his field who sights a tornado hauling towards him and puts his head down, reckoning if he don't look up and admit to its coming, it might some ways pass him by. But Amy's belly had just kept on waxing like the moon. Now as the dog star raised up with the morning sun, that tornado I'd closed my eyes to had sucked me up in it, and I had no notion of where it would set me down. But I was about to find out on an August dog day when most everything that surrounded me seemed to have lain down and died. Whose child is it? Amy said, repeating me as she raised her blue eyes to mine. It's my child, Billy, but it can be ours if you want. For saying that gave me pause, because there's currents that run deep in a woman, too deep for a man to touch their bottom. I seen the look on Amy's face when her younger sister's children crawled into her lap. I'd heard her in the kitchen singing for the last few months when I came up from my field. Amy had always carried a pretty tune, but there was a difference now, a kind of smile in her voice I'd never heard before. She hadn't been singing because of Holland Winchester. At least that's what I reckoned. But I had to know for sure. What about him? I asked, not wanting to own up Holland's name, because if I did, I'd bring his face and body back into the house, and I'd see what I'd been hauling in my head for months now. Holland Winchester and Amy in the back room, their clothes half off, him between her legs like a plow in a furrow. What about him, Amy said, repeating me again. You leaving me for him, I said. For now that we'd started, it was best to go ahead and see how the land lay between us. Amy looked at me, her blue eyes steady as a plumb line. No, I'm your wife, Billy, not Holland's. I suppose that should have assuaged me some, but right then I didn't feel nothing like good. Every man must eat a peck of dirt before he dies, Daddy once told me. I felt I was eating of it by the shovelful. When's the last time you saw him? 2 months ago, Amy said. Soon as it took, I told him not to come around no more. What'd he say to that? He didn't say much. I told him certain it was over and done with. See, now you got a baby coming. No, that's not his concerning, Amy said. What's happened between me and him is finished, but it ain't finished between us without you want it to be. That child can be mine or it can be ours. Amy lifted her hand and brushed back a strand of yellow hair that had fell over her eye. So what you going to do, Billy? At that moment, I truly did not know. I knew what many a man might do. He'd raise his hand and slap Amy stout enough to lay her flat on the floor. Some would do worse. Then they'd walk out the door and never come back. Do you love me? I finally said, my eyes steady on hers. That was my last question, the one that most mattered. Amy's blue eyes looked tired the way they'd been a lot the last couple of months. But she looked pretty, prettier than she'd ever looked. Her bosoms and hips fuller, her skin bright and glowing like she'd bathed in a tub of sunshine. Yes, she said. You swear you'll never be with him again? I've done told you that, Amy said. Swear it then, I said. I swear it, Amy said. And the point I wanted to make there was I had to make a decision. There's that moment when I said, I knew that many another man, what he'd do, he'd raise his hand and slap Amy stout enough to lay her flat on the floor. I kind of cringed when I wrote that. But I think one of the questions when you write historical fiction is, for me personally, one of the dangers is, well, I'll impose 2012 attitudes onto a character living in 1952. And I felt like to be true to that culture at that moment, he had to think that. He's a character I want the reader to feel great sympathy for, but at the same time, I felt like I had to be true to that world.
Let's take Ron's question along the line. Javier, how do you deal with the gap between, and dramatize the gap between, the attitudes of your readers, the values of your readers, and the values of those people in the time that you're writing about? Do you muffle that gap? Do you dramatize it? Do you ignore it? What do you do?
I don't know. I guess I ignore it. I mean, I'm not sure that I write about the past. I don't write historical novels, historical fiction. I feel that I write about the relationship between the past and the present, which is different. He quoted Faulkner, past is not even past. Well, for me, that was a real discovery. I began as a writer writing about the present, just present. I wanted not to be a Spanish writer, but an American postmodernist writer or something like that.
Of course.
Yeah, of course, as everybody else writes. And my first books, which I'm proud of them, are like this kind of postmodern, playful, ironic, etc., Borges and so on and so forth. But when I was like 38, 37, this Soleus of Salamis, I was 39 when I published the book. And at that point, maybe because then I had a past. I was like 38 and 39. You have a past. You know, you are kind of began to be old. Then at that moment, writing the book, I made two discoveries. One of them was the essential discoveries that you cannot explain the present without the past. So that, I mean, the past is not something that is there and you can, I mean, it's there and has no relationship with the present, but it's something that is still here, that you cannot understand the present without the past. So the relationship between these two things is what is interesting in my book, what interested me. I mean, this book is not about the Civil War. For instance, this Soleus of Salamis is about how the Civil War still is in Spain for a lot of people. Well, for all of us. Why it is impossible to understand our present with this past. That was one of the discoveries which was essential for me. And all my books from that moment have this discovery very present. And then the other one is that you cannot understand yourself without the others. You cannot understand the individual without the collectivity, let's say. Is it possible to say that? Well, this is... So I don't feel I speak about the past. I speak about these two things. I mean,
Jenny, would you agree with that? In your writing, are you speaking about the past or the present, or both?
Naja, I think in the stories which are further away from me, I try to go into the time I'm writing about. I read a lot of books, or I try to find someone to speak to and to ask how was it or whatever. So I try to get a feeling for how it was at first. But I think the look I put on several stories of one book is I look out of the present, even to the things that are far away from me. So in the chapters themselves, I try to go back. But if you take the book as a whole, and you have 12 chapters, and they are leading from the very beginning of the century to the end, then you step back and you look at all stories, and I think this look at it makes the presence of it.
It explains the present. It makes sense of the present.
Yeah, and it makes only sense from the present, because I've got the chance to look at things that couldn't be understood in the same way from my point of view. So if I tell a story which takes place in the 30s, of course I look as a person from today's at these 30s. And
you're not pretending that you're a figure in the 1930s talking about that, but you are a figure of today talking about the past.
Yeah, I try to give the surrounding, so to say, more or less as it was.
Yes. But
the look is from nowadays.
Kate, do you deal with that same question that Ron raises about attitudes of the past, attitudes of the present? How you draw a character in a novel that is to be read today about the past? What do you do with what now seems ugly in retrospect?
Look, I think one of the things that is that a novel is about an individual, whereas often our thoughts about the past are about, as Javier says, the collectivity, a sort of stereotype or a cliche of the past. But one of the great freedoms of writing fiction about the past is that you are taking an individual. And yes, it may be that in 1952 a lot of men would have, beaten their wives, but many would not have. And in a way, they're the ones we don't hear about. And so the freedom of writing writing a novel set in the past is that you can write about an individual. Like Javier and like Eugenia, I'm only interested in today, The past is only interesting insofar as it is a doorway. It explains where we are today. I'm not interested in a sort of diorama, a beautiful reconstruction, a perfect reconstruction of the past, for many reasons, one of which is that could only be phony. We don't actually know. We only have these kind of generalised views. I really resist the label historical fiction, because to me that summons up a kind of museum diorama, every detail precise, every research, the names correct. And that seems to me a dangerous sleight of hand that I'm not that interested in. It's today. The problems of my characters are still the problems that we solve in Australia today. You know, whenever we... The other thing is that the truth is often unacceptably uncomfortable. All the histories that we're writing about, I think, have their unbearable quality. And part of the job of fiction, I think, is to sugar the pill, maybe, make it bearable. I mean, I think when you read a novel, you allow yourself to go into a very dangerous place. And you do that knowing that at any moment you can close the book and you can say, it's just a story, it's just a novel. So that means that you can go quite a long way into that dark place before you retreat. You'll, you know, scrape a bit more wallpaper off the wall in the case of The Australian. A lot of people who read The Secret River, there's a massacre at the end of The Secret River, and an awful lot of people have said to me, I stopped reading the book because I knew the massacre was about to happen. And that really interests me. I mean, I'm kind of disappointed, but actually the fact that they knew what was going to happen revealed to them that they already knew this story. In a way, I didn't have to tell them. They already knew it, and the fact that they had to close the book at that point told them that is a huge journey for them. So I've forgotten where that started.
And they'd go right to the lip of it, but they wouldn't go over.
That's right, yes. But they knew what was there. You know, the truth was there, and I had taken them to that lip. And before that, they would not have even been prepared to take a single step.
A lot of people must imagine that the great thing about writing in the past is that you can say what you like. But it strikes me, again tonight, forcibly, talking to the four of you, that you've all worked bloody hard to work out what really did happen before you write your fictions about it. What are your obligations to know? What are the obligations? Are they absolute? Do you have to know, Ron? Do you have to know exactly?
I'm not even sure you can know exactly, you know, whether you're a historian or whatever. But I mean, I think what we're trying to do is create the illusion. I mean, we are novelists ultimately. We're not historians. We're not philosophers necessarily. So, for me, it's a matter of, you know, I mean, one thing that I've learned about novels, which is interesting, is that very often people read novels to learn about real things. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, they are interested. You know, what would it be like to live in the outback in, you know, 1888, or what would it be like to live in the Appalachian Mountains in 1950 and be a farmer? What, you know, even little minutiae such as crops and things like that. I mean, I think that is something that we do. But you know, for me, ultimately, I think it's just. It's what I have to write. I have to write about the past, or I have to write, you know, it's almost like the subject chooses me, not so much I choose the subject. But I always go back to something that William Faulkner said. I'm not going to quote him again tonight, but...
he's quotable, it's okay.
I mean, he is, I think he is my country's greatest writer. I really believe that. But Faulkner, somebody asked Faulkner late in his life, he said, well, talking about themes, or you write, what are your major themes in your work? What are you trying to say about history? All this, and Faulkner said, I write about people. And to me, ultimately, speaking at least for myself, but I suspect there would be some agreement that ultimately what we are writing about is what it means to be a human being. What is it to be alive? And I think one of the things that happens when you write about the past is that you're trying to at least give a sense of the illusion or your interpretation of what would it feel like to be at this time, in this place.
When do you get into trouble as historical writers? Javier, did you cause trouble with Soldiers of Salamis? Did people stand up and say...
Oh, a lot of problems, yeah. I got a lot. No, really. For example, I'm going to tell you one story which is absolutely real. In Soleus of Salamis, when you deal with real characters, it is possible that you're in problems. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I have a lot of stories, but I'm going to tell you one story. This book, all the characters of the book have real names and correspond to real human beings. Even the main character, who is Javier Cercas. It's a real character. It has a real name. Okay, so all are real, except one, which is the, yeah, but it's a real name. At least it's a real name.
It's a real name,
yeah.
yeah.
Javier Cercas is a fictitious character, but it's a real name. So, but one of them is totally fictitious, from the beginning to the end, which is a fortune teller, which is the girl of the main character, of the Javier Cercas, fortune teller who is on TV, works on TV, etc. So, and the fortune teller of the local TV. And the real fortune teller of the local TV in Girona sued me. I went to the jury because she thought she was herself. I was finally absolved, but...
You won.
I won, but I was there with the judge talking about that. So this, yeah, you can have problems.
Well, actually, the same novel I was mentioning earlier that had, it's called The World Made Straight. It's my third novel, and the heart of the book is about a massacre in the American Civil War of civilians, including a 12-year-old boy who was killed because they were Union sympathizers in the North Carolina mountains. And that's a historical fact. There was actually, this happened. And I'd gone back to do research and read a New York Times report where, in 1863, where the last to die was the 12-year-old, and there were witnesses who had said that he was the last. The last thing he had said was, "You have killed my father and my brothers. Will you please let me go home to my mother?" And that's allegedly his last words, and then they shot him. But I got I guess about a year after the novel came out, I got a call, and I get strange calls. Have you noticed that? But this guy said, "Well, I just want to let you know that you're wrong. That 12-year-old was not the last to die." And I didn't even ask why. I mean, you don't even want to get involved. But anyway, he said, "Well, the reason I know this is because me and my paranormal team went up to Shelton Laurel, and the ghost told us this." And I was thinking, well, here's the dead. They're going to finally come back and tell us something. And what they're going to tell you is that Ron Rash got this detail wrong in his book.
Now look, something completely unexpected, but I suppose predictable, has happened, which is that we are rapidly slipping into the past. The time is over. We are not going to take any questions because we've talked too long up on the platform. I had no idea time was passing so quickly. Please don't take this as a slight from us. It's just, time has just whizzed by. I don't think there really is a past, is there? Was there a past an hour and a half ago? No.
Always present.
Or a present or a future. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end. Thank you very, very much.